Hi, everybody. It's Marlene with Eerie News. And today we're going to go into an area having to do with cold cases. All right. And this is something that was just came about recently. And if anything, I think that what we're going to see is that basically, you know how everybody that talk about the CSI expectations. Everybody thinks that DNA or forensics is going to magically produce things, but in some cases, there's results. It might take years, but even old cases are basically solved with the help of forensics and DNA. And this has to do with a 62-year-old murder, disappearance, whatever you want to call it, and it's titled "Mystery of Child's Murder Solved After 62 Years." And in 1960, Sharon Lee Gallegos, 4, was kidnapped by two persons, a man and a woman, driving an old model green car. Despite a good description of one of the kidnappers and the vehicle, as well as reporting it right away to the police, the child's fate remained unknown for 62 years. This started in July of 1960 in Alamogordo, New Mexico. Within hours, police set up roadblocks across southern New Mexico with a description of the kidnappers and the vehicle they were driving. They also described Sharon as having light brown hair, light complexion, and brown eyes. She was wearing pink shorts and white shoes. In September, she would have celebrated her 5th birthday. Sharon lived in a modest white frame house with her mother, 2 older siblings, her grandmother, and 6 other young Gallegos children. A playmate told police an old green car stopped and a woman asked Sharon to come with her and offered to buy her candy and clothes. The child refused and the woman grabbed her arm and dragged her into the vehicle. A neighbor described that the past Sunday after church, an auto fitting the description of the car was parked in the alley. The kidnapper was described as a short, overweight woman in her 30s with dirty blonde hair and wearing a faded cotton wash dress. She asked the neighbor where Lupe Gallegos lived. Lupe was Sharon's mother. The man with her appeared to be between 30 and 40 years of age and was described as slender with straight sandy-colored hair, and he had a long, prominent nose. The neighbor pointed out the house and the woman said she was looking for Mrs. Gallegos in order to give her work. The neighbor said, quote, "The strange woman also asked if Mrs. Gallegos had a little girl, whether or not she had lots of children, and if the entire family lived in the house, or if it was divided into apartments," end quote. Inside the dirty car were 2 children, a young girl and a freckle-faced boy. Another witness, an 11-year-old girl, noticed the car, which was thought to be a 1951 or 52 Dodge. She told authorities that the woman just sat and stared toward the house and didn't move when she stood in the kitchen doorway. She described that earlier she had gone to the neighborhood grocery with Sharon hours before the abduction, and that Sharon, upon seeing the green car, expressed fear and asked to be picked up and carried as they passed the vehicle. The FBI joined in the search for the child, even though ransom was ruled out since the family was from modest means. Mrs. Gallegos discounted that Sharon's father could have kidnapped her. She said, quote, "I met Frank when he was stationed at the air base near here, but he was transferred away before Sharon was born. He has never written or shown any interest in the child. I don't think he would want her. He does not even know her." At that point, authorities believed they were dealing with a child stealing case. A week after the kidnapping, police found her father, a former airman, living in a southeastern city working as a telephone company employee. He was married and had 2 children, and he had nothing whatsoever to do with the kidnapping. On July 31st, a Las Vegas school teacher and his family were rock hunting when they found a dead child in a sandy wash off Arizona 93 in southern Yavapai County. Her body was badly decomposed, and the autopsy failed to reveal the cause of death. There were no marks of physical violence, no broken bones, no puncture wounds or bruises. A pocket knife found nearby was sent to the FBI laboratories to determine if particles on the blade were dried blood. At the death scene, officers found 2 sets of footprints. One set was made by a man's shoes. The other set could have been made by the thongs the child was wearing. indicating the girl probably walked to the death scene. A set of automobile tire tracks were found, which indicated that someone drove off the road and turned around in the wash. FBI agents ruled out the possibility that who they had dubbed Little Miss Nobody was Sharon after comparing footprints. The police had no leads in establishing the dead child's identity. A Yavapai County police offered the theory that the child belonged to a transient family and died of natural causes. The family, due to lack of funds, did not report the death or bury the child. Residents in the nearby community of Prescott raised money for a funeral, and florists and a mortuary donated their services for the little girl they had dubbed Little Miss Nobody. Funeral services were held on August 10, 1960 for the child. In January 1961, Richard Arlen Lindsay and Dixie Elaine Lindsay were arrested for the kidnapping and murder of Rosemarie Riddle, age 6, in California. They were questioned regarding the disappearance of Sharon. Lindsay worked as a migrant worker, and this work carried him back and forth across the Southwest about the time Sharon was seized. Richard Arlen Lindsay, 30, was an alcoholic drifter from Texas with a history of violence against his family. He'd been arrested and sent to different mental facilities for short periods of time. Sort of violence. In 1960, he re-met his third wife, Dixie Elaine Lindsay, in a bar in Texas, and they began living together again. They both had married other people during the time they were separated. The couple lurked around the Shafter farm labor camp. Dixie Elaine Cheshire Lindsay, 26, was 8 months pregnant with either her third or her fourth child when she lured Marie Riddle from her home, offering her $1 for doing housework. She sat in the back seat of the car while her husband raped and choked the child in the front seat. He then walked off with the girl and left her in a nearby field. He wasn't sure if she was dead, and she said, "If you don't do it, I will." She grabbed a tire iron and struck the girl 19 times. The couple's picture was shown to the witnesses who had seen Sharon's kidnapping, but they were unable to definitely identify them, even though there were several similarities in appearance. Dixie Elaine Lindsay weighed 208 pounds, and the FBI found that she had dyed her hair dark when she was arrested in California. The most striking similarity was in the sharp nose of the man who drove the abduction car. Also, the Lindsays had 3 children traveling with them, which corresponded to what the neighbor had described. Investigators in California advised authorities the Lindsays had changed cars a number of times traveling from Texas to California. In January 1961, Lindsay was sentenced to death for the murder of Marie Riddle. He was executed in San Quentin's gas chamber in November of the same year. Dixie Elaine Lindsay, 23, was sentenced to 2 life terms without the chance of parole. On March 22nd, Dixie Elaine gave birth to a son, which was given in custody to her mother, Mrs. James Cheshire. It appeared that labor camps were dangerous places for children. In June of 1961, Donald Ray Riddle, 23, Ronald Earl, 19, and a 17-year-old youth, all of Wasco, were being held for investigation of rape and contributing to the delinquency of a 14-year-old girl. According to the police, Ronald Riddle and the 17-year-old boy were charged with rape, and a contributing charge was filed against the older brother. The Riddles were brothers of Everett Riddle, whose 6-year-old daughter, Rosemarie, was kidnapped and murdered only 6 months before by Richard Lindsay. Despite the tragedy that had visited their family, they themselves were predators. Then, in October 1963, an 11-year-old girl was lured away from the DeWitt labor camp where Marie Riddle had been living when she was killed. The girl was kidnapped and raped by a ranch worker who lured the girl into a car with a $1 bill. Elmer W. McCoy, 46, was charged with the kidnapping and rape. He was found a short distance from the camp gate in a car in which he was bringing the child home. He died in 1983, age 66. Once the headlines faded concerning the Lindsays and the heinous crimes they committed, there was no further information as to why they were excluded as suspects in the murders of Sharon Lee Gallego. In 2015, the child's body was exhumed for DNA examination, and eventually there was a match to one of Sharon's living relatives. Fast forward to March 15th, 2022, and according to the New York Post, DNA evidence and facial reconstruction have solved the 62-year-old mystery that the child found in 1961 in Arizona was indeed Sharon Lee Gallegos. Her mother, Guadalupe Gallegos, passed away in 2011, and her sister Ramona Chavez in 2017. Why the woman who stalked her was so persistent and openly targeted her is unknown. That she was stolen in broad daylight only a few feet from her home indicates this crime was not one of opportunity. Also, why she was driven 500 miles away and killed remains a mystery as well. So, despite the tragedy of what happened with that child, there was at least some resolution for the family. At the time when she was kidnapped, she had that older brother and sister. The older sister had passed away, and only the brother was was alive, as far as the the people that were around, as far as siblings. Even though there was like a quite a large extended family living there, and sometimes, like I ask, newspapers cover things when they're going to draw in audience, obviously, and it never explains why at some point the Lindsays were not considered suspects, or more than they were. Maybe was it because they couldn't be definitely identified, or sometimes prosecutors satisfy themselves saying, "We got him definitely with on the murder of this child of Marie Riddle in California. We've got an airtight case. We don't want to muddy the water as long as we got him, and we've got her." God, that to think that really the one that killed her was his wife, and maybe they left it at that. And obviously, if you're a prosecutor, I imagine that you can't prosecute somebody for one crime and then go to the family and say, "By the way, don't worry about it. We got him, but we're not gonna come out and charge them with the with with this case of the murder of Sharon." Maybe they just kept it to themselves and said, "This is the best we're going to get out of this," or maybe not. Maybe it wasn't them. Who knows? But that from the get go, it looks like there was there, there was something there. I'll tell you that much, as far as similarities, and it makes you wonder, like, how much did and they, from what I understand, they moved in these circles of the migrant workers or labor camps where they traveled around. And because I'm wondering that this woman came and specifically asked for Mrs. Gallo, was just Sharon's mom. It wasn't like, "Hey, we found this little girl and she's walking by herself and we snatched her because the opportunity presented itself." No, she was pretty open about wanting to get that specific child. Okay, now I'm going to go on to, this is another story. This is a cold case story. Um, and like I said, some of these cold cases, sometimes they get resolved, sometimes they don't. Sometimes it has to do with, even, number one, that they can actually retrieve DNA material to begin with from the victim somehow, even though I know they're getting better and better at it. And then, of course, that they have DNA to compare it to, as in from uh, one of the relatives. Okay, this story is called, it's a cold case, and it's called Little Miss X, and this occurred in 1958. All right, it was Halloween 1958. Let me see, here we go. When, off a dirt road on Skinner Ridge south of Grand Canyon National Park, the skeletal remains of a young girl were found. Her body was nude, and it was estimated she had been there 9 to 14 months. Like all cases conducted decades ago, many files have been lost. The coroner's inquest is one of them. The name on the girl's file was Little Miss X. According to Joe Sumner, volunteer investigator for the Coconino County Sheriff's Office Cold Case Unit, it was always handled as a homicide. "She's never been identified," Sumner said. "This is our oldest case that's considered a homicide." In October 1958, deer hunters came across a skeleton in the Moki district of the Kaibab National Forest. The skeleton was on top of a thick mat of pine needles near the Skinner Ridge Road. The hands, feet, and part of an arm and leg bones were missing. Sheriff Cecil Richardson first believed the bones belonged to a young man, but the anthropologist at the Museum of Northern Arizona concluded they belonged to a female in her teens. Doctors who later examined the remains said she must have been dead at least a year at that time. Her clothes were found across the road from the body. A saddle was found and also a second skeleton. The hunters reported they had seen it close by. Nothing further was reported as to what became of these findings. In 1962, the girl's skull was exhumed, and Dr. John Stilley, a Flagstaff dentist, went over the dental structure of the skeleton. He was convinced the remains belonged to Connie Smith of Sundance, Wyoming, who had been his patient. She was the granddaughter of former Wyoming Governor Nels H. Smith, who had disappeared from a Connecticut camp in 1952 when she was 10 years old. Constance Christine Connie Smith was staying at Camp Sloan the summer of 1952. She had a fight with some female campers on the morning of July 16, 1952. She got a bloody nose from the altercation. The next morning, she skipped breakfast and told the other girls in her tent she was walking to the dispensary to drop off an ice pack she had used. The ice pack was left in the tent, and she never went to the dispensary. She was seen walking away from camp and down Indian Mountain Road. Several people saw Connie picking daisies along the roadside and asked people who slowed down how to get to Lakeville, Connecticut, which was about a half-mile away. There was no doubt she was homesick, and ironically, she only had one more week's stay at the camp. Later in the day, she was seen walking on U.S. Route 44 in Salisbury, thumbing a ride. Without money or extra clothes, it appeared she hoped to hitchhike to Lakeville. She was never heard from again. Counselors realized she had left that same afternoon when the ice pack was found in her tent. A search did not produce any clues. There's been many suspects in her disappearance, but no one has been charged with a crime. It was theorized she was running away to go to one of her parents, both which were divorced from each other. Neither of them heard from her after the day of her disappearance. Her mother had last seen her 2 days before when she visited the camp. She was in good spirits and asked her mother to stay longer at the camp, but her mother told her no. One of the suspects was William Henry Redmond, a one-time carnival worker who strangled an 8-year-old girl in 1951 named Jane Marie Altoff. She was found dead April 26, 1951 in a truck on the grounds of a Penn Premier show carnival and trainer. Redmond's fingerprints were found in the cab of the truck, and a warrant was issued for his arrest in January 1952. He had disappeared, and the warrant couldn't be served. He never went back to pick up his paycheck, which indicates he feared police would be looking for him. Redmond had been arrested twice in the 1930s for attacking girls and was sentenced to the Ohio State Reformatory and the Ohio State Mental Hospital. In 1963, he moved to Nebraska and learned to live a quiet life. Malcolm Murphy, a Pennsylvania state trooper, had taken over the cold case in 1985 and in 1988 arrested him after he had made a statement to police inculpating himself. While being held pending his trial, he told another inmate he killed 4 people during his lifetime. Eventually, he was sent back to Nebraska when it was determined he was too ill to stand trial for Jane Altoff's murder. He died in 1992. He was suffering from emphysema. However, in 1952, when he left Pennsylvania, he might have crossed paths with Connie Smith the July afternoon she ran away from camp. However, police have never been able to determine if he was in Connecticut. He passed a polygraph test concerning Connie's disappearance. However, we know sometimes these polygraph tests are not as provide proof as airtight as we think. Then, in the 1980s, Redmond allegedly told another prison inmate, about what he had done. So, those 4 people, who were they? One of them was the girl he strangled, but that leaves 3 others. Now, samples of Connie Smith's hair were compared to strands still clinging to the skull. Eventually, medical experts were unable to match the remains of Little Miss X with that of Connie Smith, so that ruled out Connie Smith. Then, in 1969, artist and anthropologist Barton Wright drew a likeness from the skull. According to him, she was Mexican Indian or Mexican Caucasian, age 13 to 17, 5 feet 3 inches, about 110 pounds, with dark brown hair bleached to light brown. She had 7 silver amalgam fillings in 4 teeth and wore a 10-carat gold metal chain. Her clothing was described as capri pants with a brown, red, and green plaid pattern with a label world famous Graf California wear and a white wool cardigan. The clothing found near the body appeared too big. There was a nail file and a comb. Now, in that same area, there was another disappearance of Mary M. Begay. She was 20 years old. She went missing at the South Rim in 1957. She was excluded as well. She worked at the Bright Angel Lodge at Grand Canyon National Park. She was last seen in August when she and 3 friends walked from their employee housing dorm to the Grand Canyon Inn to do some drinking. One of her companions said Begay got into a vehicle with 2 unknown Hopi men. She didn't show up for work and she was fired. They boxed up her belongings, and when her family came for a visit, they discovered she had disappeared. She was reported missing to Navajo authorities. The connection to Little Miss X was that the clothing found near the remains matched the clothing Begay had been wearing when she was last seen. Later, authorities interviewed Begay's co-workers. One of them said she believed Begay fled her life and was living in Los Angeles and didn't want her family to know where she was. Another said she heard Begay had a child and lived in Oregon. Neither lead panned out. Begay, prior to her disappearance, had been in touch with her family on a consistent basis, and she was not estranged from them. Present-day Begay would be in her 80s, and many of her family members have passed away. The Grand Canyon Inn was demolished in the 1960s. Now, there was another theory that the nail file could have belonged to Donis Marie, nicknamed Pinky Redman, a South California 15-year-old who went missing the same year. Bones found in the old Flagstaff mortuary dating back to the 1960s were thought to belong to Michael Griffin, her boyfriend, but it turned out they didn't. Pinky Redman was eventually excluded because she did not match the physical descriptions or the physical characteristics of Little Miss X. Pinky was last seen in Las Vegas, Nevada on March 1st, 1958. She and her boyfriend Michael Griffin were in San Pedro, California when they eloped to Las Vegas, a 4.5-hour drive away. Neither of them have ever been heard from again. Griffin's car, her boyfriend, he was driving a white 1950 or 51 Dodge Clipper with twin exhaust and loud mufflers. It was found in Williams, Arizona. Several days later, Williams is more than a 3-hour drive from Las Vegas. Years later, another complication developed. Plans were made to re-exhume Little Miss X's bones in order to get DNA evidence. However, after it was exhumed in 1962, the new burial place was not recorded. It's believed it's likely back at Citizen Cemetery. We don't know where the body's buried. We've combed over the old burial records of the time and haven't been able to figure out where she might be, Sumner said. This is the investigator that's on the case now. He added, she was well cared for. Somebody was missing her at the time. Okay. And again, here we come where without being able to identify her from the get-go, it's like if they were ever if if they ever find her, what was left of her and buried somewhere in that cemetery, because when after they exhumed it and they put it back, that was the end of that. If they ever find the skull, and if they're ever able to extract DNA evidence, and how would they know where to go with this? Unless they made a match somehow obscurely to, and I know that a lot of families now have put in, the ancestry or something like that. Otherwise, okay, you have DNA evidence, but you still don't have a name. You wouldn't even know who maybe to match it up against. All right, maybe it might have an answer, but again, sometimes these skeletal remains or whatever's left of them, a lot of them, they never have any idea who they are. And by the way, people don't realize that sometimes killers, serial killers, whatever you want to call them, they kill people, women, men, whatever, whoever they killed, and they don't even know the name of their victim. That's why sometimes they'll say, I killed, like this guy, I killed 4 people. A lot of times, this was, for lack of a better word, a stranger on stranger crime, and they themselves can't say, this person, their name was whatever. So even if they say arrest a certain perpetrator, let's say for another crime, sometimes if they're willing to, they'll say, oh, I dumped the body here, and hopefully they'll find the body there. But if not, they themselves, when they say, I don't know who she is, they really don't know who that person is. So sometimes, in other words, DNA does have some limitations, because otherwise what happens is, in other words, it's great if you have a starting point and an ending point, as who was the person to begin with, and then later on, who could we match it at to definitively say this is the person. Now the next case, it's called Prom Queen's Murder Solved After 60 Years. All right. Um, an, an ex-priest accused of killing a South Texas beauty queen in 1960 was found guilty of her murder. This happened in 2018. All right. John Fate, now 85, sat stone-faced and showed no emotion as he was convicted of killing Irene Garza, a 25-year-old school teacher, when he was 27 and serving as a fill-in priest in the valley. Family members of the victim hugged each other after the verdict was read. Garza was last seen going to Sacred Heart Catholic Church in McAllen, where Fate heard her confession. Her body was found 5 days later in a canal. Autopsy results showed she had been raped while unconscious and died of asphyxiation, likely from suffocation. Garza's grisly killing during Holy Week 1960 haunted South Texas for decades and was a subject of a 48 Hours television special. Fate's conviction brings an end to one of the oldest cases in the Hidalgo County judicial system, but leaves unresolved allegations of a deal cut between the district attorney and church leaders to stop the investigation into Fate and avoid a scandal. The trial had been expected to take up to 2 weeks, but ended after 5 days of testimony. This is a case about betrayal, murder, and a cover-up, said Assistant District Attorney Michael Garza, lead prosecutor, in the closing arguments. He said Fate was a wolf in priest clothing. Garza, who was no relation to the victim, described Fate as a predator set loose on the young devout women of McAllen, then a small agricultural community where no one doubted the moral authority of the Catholic Church. In his closing, Fate's attorney, Renee Flores, was critical of the lack of physical evidence linking Fate to the crime and pointing out conflicting eyewitness testimony that placed Garza at the church after the attack is thought to have occurred. Much of the evidence appeared circumstantial, and Flores questioned witnesses who waited decades to come forward with testimony, including Father Joseph O'Brien, an assistant pastor who told a Dallas Morning News report in 2004 that he elicited a confession from Fate. That might be circumstantial, but that's pretty strong. Responding to the lack of physical evidence, Garza noted that even O'Brien, now deceased, was complicit, helping dispose of items found at the rectory belonging to the victim. Garza said in his closing, "How can you test what you can't collect?" Garza questioned. The cover-up continues. The elderly Fate added to the courtroom drama Wednesday when he briefly considered taking the stand to address, quote, "several things that have been said about me that I feel like I need to correct," end quote. He decided not to testify on the advice of his attorney, he said. Garza was a second-grade teacher who had been Miss All-South Texas Sweetheart in 1958 and a former prom and homecoming queen at what then was Pan American College. The cold case lay dormant for decades until Dale Tackney, a former monk at the monastery, contacted San Antonio police claiming that years before, Fate had confessed to putting Garza in a bathtub at the pastoral house. As he left the room, Fate heard her say, "I cannot breathe," Tackney testified. He felt no remorse for what he had done, Tackney said, only that he was haunted by the sound of Garza's heels. O'Brien's testimony came later. So, 1960 to 2008. 2018, I'm sorry. That's a long time, but considering, and I'm going to say, I mean, I'm glad that things like this, they have some resolution, whether it's through DNA or because in this case, uh, people that before were unwilling to come forward actually do. Maybe as they get older, their conscience says, I can't take this to the grave with me. But I think part of my problem with this, also, if you want to look at it that way, is this took what, 1960? We're talking what, a lifetime. All right, 68 years. All the people, or the parents, the family that by now are dead. Okay, by now are gone. The people that would have wanted to have answers, to get some type of justice. Because let's face it, this thing about turn the other cheek, yeah, right, okay. But you know what? If you have a family member, a child of yours that's been killed, and I'm not going to say that thing about no, it won't bring them back. No, it won't. But I guarantee you, there's part of you as a human being. I don't care how charitable you want to be, who's got to feel better that somebody's being held responsible. All right, for what they did. All right. Plus the how can I tell you how many other people might be saved? If you have a some type of psychopath or serial killer or whatever the case might be, or predator that is going out there doing the same thing. Yeah, I have a problem because that family member, that family is always left wondering, did this person get away with it? I never had the satisfaction. That's what it is, the satisfaction of seeing this person go to jail. This person, and especially somebody in this case who covered himself with the priesthood, okay, and and other people and other. It's not just because he's a priest, because there's been other killers and other criminals who use positions of authority or titles to like shield themselves like from real good scrutiny by the police, or that from not being questioned too hard. I think that's even worse, okay, because um, the chances are that I can't say because I really don't know it for a fact that if they didn't, they thought about it really, really hard. Who knows if he ever did anything like that again. 68 years is a long time. And you know what? And what's really funny is you look at pictures of this man now in his old man in his 80s, and he's there in the courtroom with a walker, and you're like, oh my God, that poor old guy, that poor old guy. Hui, you know? Yeah, sometimes it's like. But anyway, let's get on to the last story. This is a titled when I'm going into cold cases today. 50-year-old cold case solved. In 1966, Louise Petrowitz disappeared without a trace. The mystery of her whereabouts appeared to be solved with the discovery of a woman's remains found in a burlap sack on Long Island. In October 1966, Louise Petrowitz, 38 at the time, closed her bank account and left town with her then boyfriend, police officer William B. Pocken. Boken, I'm not sure how to pronounce that. She had bought plane tickets for her 11-year-old daughter and herself to travel to Florida. Then she disappeared. Her purse was recovered a week later on the shoulder of Route 25. The police treated the case as a missing person and not a murder, and the local newspaper took no notice of it. Following her disappearance, detectives interviewed her husband, who claimed he was humiliated by her betrayal and didn't care if she was alive or not. A year later, William Bakken, Louise's lover, was arrested on suspicion of abusing his wife Judy and was committed to a psychiatric hospital. He was never prosecuted over Louise's disappearance, having been declared mentally ill. Alvin Petrowitz, Louise's husband, divorced his missing wife in 1974 and remarried 2 years later. He died in 2000. Now, on March 19, 2018, inside a centuries-old farmhouse on Lower Road within a burlap sack, buried 6 feet under the cellar, sonar equipment helped police unearth the bones, or what are believed to be those of Louise Petrowitz, who disappeared in 1966. Supposedly, she was leaving behind an abusive relationship and an 11-year-old daughter, who now lives in upstate New York. It seems she didn't make it out of Suffolk after all. Now, her daughter said she was a lovely woman. She didn't deserve what she got. And I've cried a lot of tears over this, believe me, and it's great finding her. I'm glad my uncle is still here, is still able to be here. And you know what? I think that resonates with what I was just saying. That in some cases, after so many years, the people that were there that basically were suffered at the very incept of the crime, whatever it was, whether it was a missing person or whatever, that they at least, God, if resolution is an adequate word, have that. Um, Very emotional, very emotional. I break down. Her brother Leon Jasinski said, "Thank God it's over. For 52 years, Petrowitz's family has been looking for her, unaware of a secret love affair she had with a married man. When she was reported missing, she had a relationship with William Bakken, who was, at the time, a Suffolk police officer." This is by Police Chief Jared Giganti. Suffolk Police and New York State Police say they investigated, then the case went cold. They weren't able to locate her. William Bakken, a few days after she was missing, resigned from the police department and essentially disappeared. Police received information from Bakken's ex-wife, who told them where to dig in the home. Bakken died in 1982. Now, the they gave a proper funeral and everything, and the family suspects that she was murdered because she was pregnant with Bakken's child, which of course I don't think there's any way for them to verify one way or another. Um, and now what happened was, it turns out that more than one person knew where the victim was buried. Shortly before the discovery of Louise Petrowitz's remains, Judith Terry, the former wife of the suspected killer, revealed she had told one person about the murder, but it wasn't just any person. It was the chief of police at the time the murder took place. According to the Suffolk Times, they requested a FOIA about this incident, and it seems that Bakken's former wife, her name is Judy, had told Detective Kenneth Reichert during an interview in March 15, 2018. He asked if she had told anyone she had witnessed her then husband burying a body in the basement of their home. And she stated that at some point, and she doesn't remember when, she told Joseph Sawicki Sr. what had happened. Detective Reichert wrote about that interview, which he told a retired Detective Conway, who was also helping him, saying she stated that she was very close with him, Sawicki, and him and his wife, and was godmother to one of their children, and because he was a police officer. Now, Joseph Sawicki happened to be the police chief at the time of Louise's disappearance. So in other words, not only was there that connection, that she was close to him and his wife, she was a godmother of one of their children. But there's also another reason why she didn't say anything. Now, Sawicki Sr. worked for the Southold Town Police Department for 29 years and died in 2013. He retired as a detective in 1980 and acted as chief in the mid-1960s. In January 2019, an attorney on behalf of the Sawicki family issued the following statement. "Our family has followed the Bakken case matter with interest over this last half century. Our husband and father was Joseph H. Sawicki Sr., Southold Town police officer from the 1950s. He was acting chief for the years 1964 to 1967 and served as detective sergeant until his retirement in 1981. Mr. Sawicki passed away approximately 5.5 years ago." Constance Sawicki, Mr. Sawicki's widow, issues the following statement on behalf of her family. Quote, "I remember clearly Judy Bakken, who later remarried and became Judy Terry, told my husband, who was chief of police at that time, that a body was buried in the basement of her home. Based on that information, my husband, Joe, went with 2 state police troopers to dig up and search the basement. He returned home after the search stating, 'We found nothing.' The family notes that Southold Detective Joseph Conway searched and dug in the same basement in 2013 and found nothing. Detective Sergeant John Sinig searched and dug with the Suffolk County Police Homicide Squad in March of 2018 and again found nothing. Apparently, after re-interviewing Judy Terry, a fourth search was found using sonar and radar techniques. The Sawicki family remains proud of Joe's exemplary service to the community as fire chief, police chief, fire commissioner, and town official. Any implied or explicit negative implications regarding his conduct of investigations is a reckless distortion and a disregard for the truth. Well, let's see. Despite the discovery of Louise's body in 2018, the circumstances of her disappearance was whispered about among the small community for years, but it didn't go any further than that. Of course, no arrests were ever made, and it wasn't until the case was revisited in 2018 with an in-depth interview of Judith Terry that the discovery of the secret grave was made. At this time, by the time in 2018, Judith Terry was in her 80s. Looking back at the initial investigation, it appears that only the minimal effort was given into discovering the whereabouts of Louise Petrowitz, which lay only 7 feet beneath the surface of the basement. It was only using a diagram drawn by Judith Terry and her recollection as to the hole's depth that police would ultimately find Louise's remains. In another statement, this was given by a former state investigator, Thomas Colby, in December of 1969. He then mentioned an interview with Chief Sawicki and others that failed to lead them to Louise. And it said, Bud Griffiths, a retired state investigator who had looked into the case at the request of Louise's family, said investigator Colby's partner, Dick Fairchild, had told him that Chief Sawicki was present one day, 14 months after the murder, when they dug in the basement and found nothing. Mr. Griffith said no mention was made at the time of Miss Terry telling the chief that she witnessed the burial. He said investigator Fairchild told him that Chief Sawicki observed but did not help with the digging efforts. Fairchild said they had no cooperation from the town's police department, Mr. Griffith said. So in other words, they have an investigator going out there digging, and instead of this chief saying, by the way, I was told by the officer, the couple, the wife that used to live here, who was the officer, that she saw him bury a body in the thing. He doesn't say anything. And he doesn't even help in the digging. I'm sorry, but that's a problem. Because you would think that, in other words, it's like, hey, I tried and maybe I didn't find anything, but we have good reason to believe that there is got to be something there because we have this officer's ex-wife telling us that she witnessed this. That puts a whole different spin on, like, well, let's dig and hope we find something. Just on a hunch, in other words. Now, this officer, William Paul Bakken, died August 20th, 1982, and was buried in Pottersfield, Hart Island, Bronx, New York. His ex-wife, Judy Terry, did not know about this until 2018. It appears that once reassured that he was indeed dead, she felt more confident in speaking about what she had witnessed. She told detectives that she suspected Louise was interred in the basement because of the threatening comments Bakken made along the lines that he would kill and bury her in the same spot. Detective Sergeant Sinning wrote of his interview with Judith Terry, and this is what he said. Miss Terry had a clear and detailed memory of the layout of the basement of the house on Lower Road. During that conversation, she went much further than in previous interviews and admitted witnessing her husband bringing a body into their basement. I was there when he brought her into the house, she told a detective. He laid her on the cement floor. I don't know if she was dead or alive. I would assume she was dead because she was wrapped in a burlap or something. Detective Sergeant Sinning wrote, Judith states that she never saw Louise again. 4 days later, Detective Sergeant Sinning reported receiving a call from Miss Terry's husband, George, who said his wife had since recalled even more details. Mr. Terry said his wife told him Mr. Bakken had demanded that she untie that she untie the binds around the burlap before he rolled Louise out of the burlap and into the hole. Miss Terry expanded on her account during the subsequent March 15th interview with Detective Reichert and former Detective Conway, Jr. She said she saw Mr. Bakken carrying the body wrapped in burlap out of the barn behind their house, and that, after he began digging in the basement, he realized that he could be seen from outside through the basement windows. He then switched locations, Miss Terry said, and dug a new hole. Detective Sergeant Sinning gave Louise's daughter the clothing found with her mother's remains. It included a slip, garter, and blouse. There were bullet holes in the claw, along with a .38 caliber bullets found in the body. The ME concluded she had died from 3 gunshot wounds to her torso. Review of police personnel files shows that Bakken used sick days right before Louise's disappearance on October 6, 1966. He resigned from the department on October 7th. Strangely, the police blotter from 1966 is among several years missing from the town's archives. So, it's really funny because this woman who was married to Mr. Bakken, the previous Mrs. Bakken, she had to be reassured in 2018 that he really was dead. In other words, they divorced soon after. He was abusive towards her. And she had lost track of him with good reason, but she was unaware that he had died many, many years before. She had to be reassured, because even though she was elderly, even after so many years, she was afraid of him. With good reason, by the way. In other words, it's almost like, even though this happened, what, years and years, decades ago, and I haven't seen him, and I have a husband, and she still felt afraid that he could come back and make good on his threat. So, there we have the 3 cold cases. I think they're very interesting because, like everything else, sometimes, better late than never. And, sometimes cases are not resolved just because of bad timing. In other words, people are trying and just things are not discovered maybe till years later, or you have the person that in other words, some, and then maybe years later, if ever, there's some type of resolution. Some, even now, they've, with DNA, they've have found sometimes the murderers. In some cases, I found that even with DNA, they have found the perpetrator, which is in jail and or passed away. But at least they can make a connection. And then there's cases like this where you kind of see like there's a very subtle but pretty effective, how can I say it? No enthusiasm in pursuing this case. And I'm gonna say it. It could be a combination. Number one, most people think, well, this was, the police were taking care of their own. They were, remember, this is the 1960s. They're taking care of their fellow officer. But then I'm thinking to myself, wait a minute. We're talking murder. This guy is burying a body in the basement. But then the other side of it is, and I'm going to say it, and I know people are going was part of the, how can I say it? Because, hey, the person that he killed was being unfaithful to her husband. In other words, she was of lesser importance than, let's say, if it would have been a regular woman, that got snatched and killed, a pillar of the community. Because maybe she was being unfaithful to her husband, which it sounds like there was an abusive relationship going on before that she had separated, and it wasn't a good relationship. But because she had been unfaithful, this made her like, okay, even though he's a married guy, got involved with this woman, and she was being unfaithful to her husband. And I mean, was it true that she had gotten pregnant? Possibly. Why not? It happens, maybe something was going to happen that was going to blow, that it was like, you know what? I can't keep having this this affair anymore. Because I'm thinking, why would he kill her? He's married. Whether she's separated or whatever she's got going on, she's seeing him. Why would he kill her? Unless she got pregnant, unless something was going to happen that, I don't know. So again, it's interesting to see though that eventually some things they do find resolution, and at least her daughter was still alive to be able to find out really what happened to her mom. Because remember, up to a certain point, you remember this was a missing persons report. It was, don't you think that maybe even this person thought, did my mom abandon me? I was 11 years old. Did she just walk away? from this abusive relationship she had with my dad, and maybe she thought she couldn't take care of me. She just disappeared. She just went off. Remember, he left, he resigned a week after she disappeared. So don't you think that it might have crossed her daughter's mind? Did my mom just leave and ran off with her lover and I got left behind with dad? Oh, it happens. Even though it's a hard thing to think of, I'm sure it did cross her mind. But anyway, guys, I hope you like this edition of Eerie News and come back because I have a lot more Eerie News to report. So till then, take care.